No puedo, no puedo, sueño que estoy en un camino mirando que calienta el mar ya tuve. El santo remedio de la sal, mamá. Como veo sobre tu mirada, yayay, te hace ver un poco más allá. Oye bien, una luz de libertad. Oye bien, una hoguera de sonrisas y de pan. Ya tuve sueño, mamá, contigo toda la noche. Sueño, mamá, contigo toda la noche. Sueño, mamá, contigo toda la noche. Sueño, mamá, sueño, nene, mira, vamos todos con usted. Sueño, mamá, contigo toda la noche. Sueño, mamá, sueño, nene, mira lo que tengo usted. Sueño, mamá, contigo toda la noche. Oye bien, vamos, vamos, qué bien, qué bien. Sueño, mamá, contigo toda la noche. Sueño como Calderón, sueño como Calderón, la vida es sueño. ¡Oye! Sueño, mamá. Miguel.
It wouldn't be a Tertulia program if we don't read the biography. Coco Fusco is an interdisciplinary artist and writer. She's a recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, a Fulbright Fellowship, and a Herb Alpert Award in the Arts. Fusco's performances and videos have been presented in the 56th Venice Biennale, Frieze Special Projects, Basel Unlimited, 2 Whitney Biennials, and several other international exhibitions. Her works are in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Walker Art Center, the Centre Pompidou, Imperial War Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art of Barcelona. I won't go on because it's a long bio. But I just wanted to start by asking you, Coco, where did you get the nickname Coco?
Well, when my real name is Juliana Emilia Fusco Millares, but when I was born, my mother thought that I had a little round head like a coconut, un coco seco, because I had little curly hair sticking up like the little brown things that from the coconut. So that's how I got Coco. And my family would refer, you know, it's very common in Cuba and in lots of the Caribbean to have a nickname, right? So I was Coco, Coquito, Coquito, Coquito all my childhood. And then when I got to school, I saw that the American kids really couldn't pronounce Juliana, and they couldn't say even Juliana. They would say Julie, and I didn't like Julie. So I said, okay, enough of it. Just call me Coco, and like this. End this. Yeah, we'll end this right here.
Oh God. Oh my God. And so, you know, I know that, you know, you're Cuban or come from Cuban stock, you know, and you have made a career, your art career, your intellect has been about, you know, different, challenging the culture, perhaps the dominant Euro culture. I mean, I remember you in a cage at one point with another artist, and all the havoc that wrecked at that point, you know. So talk to us a little bit about your cultural influence besides the Cuban, well, most notably the Cuban, but.
So I grew up in New York.
Yeah.
True, my family from Cuba was arriving all through my childhood, and they were around me, and the story of what was happening in Cuba was not only something that I heard at home, but I mean, it was a major news story at the time. Fidel Castro was like the equivalent of Osama bin Laden in the 21st century. He was, you know, the devil, Satan, this, that, the bad guy, communism, and you know, he was all over the news all the time, in Life magazines, Newsweek's, Times. So I was asked about him, you know, Cuba and Fidel in school. I was asked by all the time. So, you know, it wasn't just at home, like the political conversations at home or the situation of my relatives or anything like that. It was also what was going on in the world around me. And, you know, whenever people who were not Cuban heard that my family was coming from Cuba, then they would ask me what I thought of Fidel and blah, blah, blah. So it was a big part of my childhood. Then when I was a teenager, I was a bit more rebellious against that whole kind of being part of an immigrant community, because, you know, teenagers they want to be part of the dominant, whatever is popular, right? So I wanted to be like my friends. I was into Stevie Wonder and the Beatles or whatever, and you know, and I wanted to dress like Annie Hall, because that film was a big hit when I was in high school. I wanted to have an afro, which really shocked my family. You know, all kinds of, and I was interested in culture. I was interested in dance. I was interested in theater. I did a lot of theater when I was in high school. So during my adolescent years, I kind of was seen as a troublemaker from the Cuban relative side. But when, you know, I think that part of my experience in college was to become a little more politically aware. And I wasn't so much focused at that time on thinking about Cuba. It was more what was going on in Central America, because at that time there was a lot of activism.
Talking about the 80s, right?
Late 70s, early 80s. Right. The time of, you know, a lot of unrest in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and there was a lot of discussion about that in universities. And so I was involved in protests against the head of the CIA and all this kind of thing when I was in college. And then this was also the time of the family reunification flights, and my mother and one of my aunts went back to Cuba and came back with stories that kind of sparked my curiosity. And then I had the opportunity to meet Cuban artists who were visiting in the 80s, and they invited me down. And so then that was the way that I was able to develop my own relationship to Cuban society and to Cuban culture that wasn't through the memories of my older relatives, right? It was new memories that you were minting as you were experiencing. And an encounter with my peers there, not just relatives, but the people who were there who were interested in the same things as me, who did the same things as I did, and I found that we shared a lot in common. But before we go even more into this, which is going to be the substance of our chat, I also want to talk about your other side. I just found out not too long ago that your dad was Italian. Italian, yes. So how did that Italian thing play also into growing up here in New York, or was that a factor or not so much a factor? You were in the Cuban sphere, like always. Well, you know, I did have some relationship with some of my father. My father died when I was young. I did have a relationship with some of my father's relatives, but he only had one sister, and she was a cloistered nun. And I did know her, but I didn't get to spend that much time with her because she was in the cloister. Okay. I had a childhood memory of her visiting her before Vatican II, when she wasn't allowed out. Oh my God, and you know, getting there with my parents, and that she would stick her hands out from between the bars, and so here I am, like a 6-year-old girl, like looking at this hand coming out of the bars, and that was very strange. She's a very sweet person, but you know, she lived in the convent. So, but anyway, you know, I did have some of a relation, but what makes it a little bit more complicated is that my parents had an interracial marriage, and you know, if any of you if you've seen, what is the Spike Lee's movie where it's about like the Italians and the African Americans? Do the Right Thing, or no? That's not that the one? Yeah, that, you know, that there it's a little bit of tension. So you know, suffice to say, it's not. You know, I've been to Italy many times. I enjoy myself in Italy very much. You know, there's a lot of things that I appreciate, but that doesn't take away that, you know, in this country there's a bit of tension between
It's
people
fraught.
of Africa. It's a fraught relationship.
Yes,
It is a fraught relationship. But I did, you know, there were many more relatives from my mother's side in the house, living with us for periods of time, helping my mother to, because I was one of three, helping my mother to raise us because she was working all the time, and you know, was the first in her family to come. So she bore the economic brunt of bringing people over, right?
Amazing.
Right. You know, especially in the 60s, especially, but you know, that kind of slowed down but continued until much later. So, so I have, you know, very vivid, and she would send me to the home of another friend of hers, someone who she studied medicine with in Cuba, who had 8 daughters.
But here, she was also here in the States?
Well, but in Miami.
In Miami.
And you know, I didn't have any sisters, and my mother, I think, felt that you know, that was a good place for me to have some female
the women
company.
folk with the women folk.
Well, to have some, but also their father Amauri was really like, I mean, he really stepped in after my father died, and wanted to help, and I would spend, you know, summertime with, you know, 8 Cuban girls in Miami.
Wow, that must have been fun.
And it was really fun, but they were even more immersed in this kind of land of, you know, frozen in time of Cubans that wanted to maintain the society of the 50s, of quinceañeras and bautismos and bodas and chaperonas, and, you know, it's like super conservative Catholic atmosphere. So I was really kind of rocked by that because it was nothing like what I was exposed to in New York.
And how did that, you went to Brown University, so then you go from, it sounds like conservative, you know, immigrant, Cuban immigrant.
But I was in a liberal private school in New York on a scholarship.
Okay, so that kind of gave you some.
Yeah, so that I was kind of a wild child in relationship to them, but I had to adapt to their way of living when I was at the house, you know, when I was with them in Miami.
But you were being exposed already in New York to a little bit of this, you know, right, more culturally.
Hippie culture.
Okay.
You know, hippie, lefties, black power, all of that. I got all of that at school. So
but you went into semiotics, which is pretty hardcore at an early time, like the early 80s, semiotics, it started.
So what happened was, you know, I got there and I was interested in literature, I was interested in, you know, dance and theater, but the semiotics program was just getting started. It was mostly a film studies program, but it was the channel through which all this new kind of new left thinking, post-structuralist thinking, was entering the university and entering academic studies. And so it was very exciting. It was like being on the beginning of something, on the cusp of a wave. And the cool kids at the university were in the department, you know, the radicals, right? And I was very drawn to that. So yeah, so I studied, I also studied kind of literature and society, which is more like a sociology of literature program. But I gravitated toward the environment in the semiotics program, which was very exciting. And you know, some of my Todd Haynes was a classmate, Ed Ball, who's won National Books Awards, Rick Moody, the novelist.
They're very accomplished people, right?
Yeah, Tony Mendoza was who's also Cuban, is like crazy artist out in California now. So, you know, there were many people who Christine Vachon, who started Killer Films and produces all of Todd's work, as well as tons of other films. We were all classmates, right? So, and there were, and Kate Doyle was also there, who's, you know, now works for National Security Archive and is an amazing investigative journalist who has done this work on Guatemala, like helping to do the trials of the generals that were in charge of the genocides during the Civil War. So, you know, we were all kids together, right? It was a very interesting group of people. We had very exciting moments of learning during that time.
Did that time, and so what is your awareness coming from that more conservative Cuban immigrant, you know, New Jersey, the summers in Miami, even though you're avant-garde here in the school, and So then what's your re-encounter with Cuba? How do you then
So-
come back to Cuba from
Right.
this other perspective? Because it's very different, and it
Right.
probably was very simpatico with Cuba, whereas our families or immigrant families could have
Were
been a
more
little
critical.
bit critical, very
Right.
critical.
So I mean, in 1979, the family reunification flights began, and one of my aunts and my mother went in that first year, and were very moved by their experiences, and both of them returned again and again after that. And so I started hearing about that, and then some cousins of mine came right after Mariel, and so it was like a new wave of people coming with stories about Cuba. And then I had the opportunity to meet a couple, in the interim, I also was working with the Argentine artist Leandro Katz.
That's after
who
you
was-
graduated from school?
Well, I
or-
met him, he was one of my professors, he was
Okay.
my film professor, and then I went to work for him as an assistant
Here in New York? Okay.
And he was part of a community of Latin American exiled artists who had come to New York in the 60s and 70s. Most of them were escaping from military dictatorships. So he introduced me to a whole world of Latin American art with living people. I mean, Juan Downey, Eduardo Costa, David Lamelas, this one, that one, Liliana Porter, Ana Mendieta, all of these people. Oiticica was his roommate before I got to the house.
Brazilian guy,
Before, not when I knew him, but before that, because by the time I knew him, Oiticica was already dead. But at that time, nobody knew who Oiticica was in New York, but I knew because Leandro was showing me his work and talking to me about their
But didn't they all
experience.
love Cuba? I mean, like, other than Ana Mendieta, who has an
did-
experience more like
Well,
yours.
I mean, she loved Cuba at that
Right.
moment. She had her re-encounter through those,
Okay.
I mean, she was one of the people who negotiated the reunification flights. She was part of El Diálogo.
Okay.
So, and this was the period in which she was going to Cuba and bringing American artists to Cuba, and that's when she did the sculptures in the caves of Jaruco, right? So, anyway, I had, and through her, all these other artists met Cuban artists and brought them to New York, and that was the way that I got to meet some of them, and they invited me to go to Cuba in 1985, which I did. I was curious, and I felt that this was the best way for me to learn about the culture, instead of having everything be channeled through my family, which is the way that I had
Grown up,
right?
or
That was the
experienced
Cuba that
Cuba.
I knew was the Cuba of the what they talked about the songs, about the food.
Inherited directly.
Right. You know, the whole, like, the culture of care, right, at home, the words of love, everything. And also, like my grandmother, when she arrived, she's like, yo no puedo con estos niños, they tienen que hablar español. So she insisted on teaching us how to speak Spanish. And I was the one who picked up the most, and ended up being like a translator for the adults and all of this. So anyway, that's the story of how I began. And when I got to Cuba, it was exciting to meet my peers,
Yes.
and they were really interesting and smart and like worldly and invested in the same kinds of cultural projects as I was interested in, and that I was really drawn to that, and I became friends with a lot of people, and then I started traveling there on a regular basis and to learn more, to do projects with them, to write about it, and so on, and those relationships continued. By the end of the 80s, some of my friends were in trouble and with the government, and there was a wave of censorship, and then many people from the 80s generation left and went to Mexico and Spain and here and there, and some ended up in the States, but I continued to go, and I still had some friends who were there, and then, there have been waves of people leaving throughout the special period and all the way to the present. So, but I continued the relationship.
The engagement.
And then after Fidel stepped down and Raúl took over, which is between 2006 and 2008.
Wait, I don't want to get there
you don't wanna
yet.
get
No,
there?
I want to
Okay.
ask you something, and
Okay.
then we want. All this is making me crave some nice Cuban music, and I think we're going.
Okay.
But before we go there, so on that trip, when you go, you know, and you're getting all excited, the spirits, did you go to Guantanamo? Your family?
The first trip, no.
No, you didn't.
The first trip was short.
Okay.
I was only there for less
Week?
than, about a week.
Okay.
I just met artists.
Okay.
That's all I did. And, but it was stunning. You know, it was, imagine after, you have your whole childhood, you
It
have
happened
this
to me.
image
Yes,
of
yes,
something, and then you get there and boom, and there it is, right?
Right.
But I saw, I met the artist, and that was very exciting. And then I also got robbed. My passport was stolen. The maids in the hotel would come into my room and ask me for my nail polish and makeup and all of this. I was with Arturo Cuenca, the artist. He invited us to go to a restaurant, and we got kicked out of the restaurant because of the way he was dressed. So I saw the other side, very quickly. And, somebody wanted my passport to be able to, right?
Leave.
So then they had to scramble and take me to the intersection to quickly have a passport made, and actually also to give me some money, because when I was robbed, they took all my money. Right?
Wow, that's a rough schlep.
No, but it was kind of like, this is Cuba, right? This is it.
It's real.
Right?
It's real.
This is real. The problems are real. The repression is real. The whole thing is real, right?
Wow. Well, and it's real that Roberto's here with us, and I want to also read a little bit about Roberto briefly. He's a unique musician living in vibrant New York City. His musical journey took him to Bogota, Colombia, not so long ago, and he spent 8 years writing, singing, performing, and also acting in musical theater and television in Colombia. His extended play, Destino Musical, from 2017, was produced there in Bogota. And he has collaborated with jazz luminaries, most notably Kip Hanrahan, and with Thema Efron on Brooklyn Nights. So without further ado, Maestro.
Canciones de amor, paisajes urbanos en cualquier parte. Estamos bien. Canciones de amor, pasiones distantes, amores sin ti. Canciones de nadie. Si ves la melodía que estalla dentro de mi alma como una locura, como la duda de tu sentimiento hacia mi pasión. Urban landscapes everywhere. We feel the same. Love songs of a distant love, love without you, songs for nobody. If you see the melody standing into my soul, like la locura, like the doubt, oh, your feelings about, oh, pasión, pasión de amor. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Pasión, determinado amor. Pasión, determinado amor. Pasión, determinado, determinado amor, amor determinado, pasión determinado. Una locura de tu cintura y mi pasión. Una locura de tu cintura y mi pasión. Oh, y una locura de tu cintura y mi pasión. Un bolero llamado Canciones de Amor, una canción escrita en Bogotá, Colombia. Ahora hagamos esta canción que se llama Ella. Una canción feminista. Ella está bien, ella está mal, ella no tiene otra necesidad, ella no tiene nada de seguir bien, de seguir mal, ella no tiene otra necesidad, ella no tiene nada. Fiebre, desarréglame de todos los sentidos, sentido mamá. Fiebre, desarréglame de todos los sentidos, sentido, 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 sentido. Ella está mal, ella está bien, ella está mal, ella no tiene nada, ella está bien, está mal, está bien, está mal, está mal, está bien, está bien, está mal, está mal, está bien, está bien, está mal, está bien, está mal, está bien, está mal, está bien, está mal. Está bien, está mal, está bien, está mal, está mal, está bien. Ella está bien, ella está mal, ella no tiene otra necesidad, ella no tiene nada de seguir bien, de seguir mal, ella no tiene otra necesidad. Ella no tiene nada. Fiebre, desarréglame de todos los sentidos, sentido, sentido, mamá. Fiebre, desarréglame de todos los sentidos. guaracha te lo digo. Ella está bien, está mal, está mal, está bien, está bien, está mal, está bien. Ella está bien, está mal, está mal, está bien. Ella está bien, está mal, está mal, está bien, está mal, está bien, bien, bien. Ella está bien, 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 bien. Mal, mal, bien, mal, mal, bien, bien, mal, mal, bien, requete bien, requete mal. Ella está regular.
Wow. And you know, it's going so fast, but there's so much to talk about and such amazing music. And I want to maybe create a bridge. So Leandro, right, was your apprenticeship?
Was my teacher and then a kind of mentor figure, and I worked for him, and he introduced me to all these artists. I mean, especially to all these Latin American artists, but also to the downtown art scene in New York.
And I want to use that because there's a bridge, some important people that I as a Puerto Rican care enormously for, and that also led to, and we have to talk about this, that thing that struck me so much, two undiscovered Amerindians visit the West. But before you met Guillermo, you met...
Pepón and Miriam.
Wow.
Right. I was just starting to write about art and film, and at the time in New York, there were not very many people of color who were published on those subjects in cultural journalism. And
what were you writing for? What was your biggest coup those days?
I actually got to write for the Village Voice a few times. I wrote for the East Village Eye. I wrote for all kinds of small magazines. I wrote for Art in America. I wrote for After Image. There was a lot more alternative press once upon a time than there is now. There were no blogs, there was no internet, but there were lots of magazines. So I wrote for a lot of them. Anyway, so they were doing a festival at the time that they called Rompeforma, right? That was a mixture of performance art and dance, and but very kind of cutting edge, to present work by Latin Americans and Latinos in New York, but they brought them from many different places. And they invited me to one of their Rompeformas to be on a panel, and it was the Rompeforma that Gómez Peña was invited to do his performance of Border Brujo, which he won a Bessie for, and that's really the piece that he did that made him known nationally, which is a monologue, right? And so I went I remember going to see the performance at Dance Theater Workshop and being like, wow, this is the most incredible, because it was like a mixture of English and Spanish and his fake Nahuatl, and he was talking about, Foucault and then border politics and geopolitics and this, and it was like everything that I'm interested in all in 1 hour, right? Wow. And then we had a panel discussion the following day, and that's when the two of us we learned of each other and started, a dialogue that eventually turned into a relationship and many collaborations and stuff. But I also continued to, stay in touch with Pepón and Merian. And when Pepón had his show at the Museo del Barrio, which I think was the first big exhibition of his work, I wrote an essay for Art in America about it. And then when I was going to do a performance at BAM, when Guillermo was performing and I was in the hallway as Isabel la Católica, I asked Pepón to make my costume, which included a wig that was in the shape of a caravel, of a carabela, right, on my head, right, that he designed. And it's very beautiful and elaborate.
Where do you keep that wig?
Well, I donated everything to the Museo del Barrio, actually. Because I didn't want it to go to waste. I didn't want it to get spoiled, and I don't have the means in my house to store something like that. I mean, it requires care. Right?
Okay. Wow. And tell me something. Will you wear that wig again? You think sometime?
I don't think so. But I think it may be in an exhibition of my work that will start in 2023.
And without getting into the exhibitions as such, the other day, I know you came to Latea, you wanted some rehearsal space because you were working on a film project.
Yes.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about this project that you're embarking or have
So,
embarked on.
yeah, I'm deep in it. But, so I decided to try to make a film based on the testimony of a colleague who's a Cuban writer, Nestor Díaz de Villegas. He's a poet and a film critic and an essayist. And in the 1970s, when he was a teenager, he was considered very extravagant and very kind of out of whack with revolutionary reality. And he wrote a poem, and he was sent to prison for 6 years for that poem. Yeah. So when he was 18, he entered Ariza prison. And in that prison, he met and became very good friends with an actor who was also there, whose name is Chema Castiñera, who's a few years older and who had been in prison already for a few years before Nestor. So he was like the big brother.
The guide.
Right. And at one point, they built a cinema inside the prison. And I was really fascinated by this idea that the prisoners made their own cinema. And also in researching the experience of many people who were in prison in Cuba in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I saw various versions of this stories of people recreating films by talking to each other or entertaining each other by creating some kind of cinema, even if it's imaginary. And so I said, I want to try to make some film about this. And so Chema had given an interview many years before in which he said that the prisoners would sit together and recall, like, it was almost like an exquisite corpse. Like, I'll do the first scene, you tell the second scene, you tell the third scene. But when I sat down with Nestor, he says, no, it wasn't like that. We actually had a cinema. We made a real cinema. But the problem is that when prisoners were in solitary, they couldn't see the screen. So Chema, the actor, would stand up and narrate his version of the movie to the prisoners who were in solitary, right? And he would, elaborate things that had nothing to do with what was going on screen. So that seemed more like comedic, and I was also drawn to that. So I worked with the novelist Enrique del Risco on a script, and then got actors and brought them here because obviously we can't shoot this in Cuba. This would never we'd never be allowed to do it.
But are they Cuban actors mostly?
Yes,
Are you working with Cubans to keep the tapestry, the texture?
Well, because really it's a very difficult accent to emulate, and it's also a difficult story to understand unless you've been part of that reality. So I did work with 3 Cuban actors. One I actually brought from Cuba, and 2 who were in Miami. Anyway, so we shot the bulk of it in the summer here in New York on a set. And now I want to go back and I had interviewed Nestor and Chema, but I want to go back and I had done it more for background, for story development, but now I want to go back and film
foreground them a little bit.
Well, and integrate their stories into my piece, because it's amazing to me that they're still around to tell these stories, but also they're both really great storytellers. I mean, there's lots and lots of testimony of political prisoners, and it's often very tragic and very moving, but many of them were not artists, right? And so they don't necessarily have a knack for storytelling. These guys have a knack for storytelling. They really are very good at it, and it's very entertaining to listen to them, and also very moving.
And when do you foresee having the rough cut? Or I know this is always very complicated and difficult.
It's not complicated, it's expensive.
Right.
So I am in the process of raising more money for post-production, because I have to do their shoot, but editing, music, sound engineering, digital color correction. There's just like all this stuff that is very, very labor intensive and costly. So I'm in the process of doing that, while also, every once in a while sitting down with, my co-producer and kind of going through all the material that we shot and putting it in order and assembling it and looking at, are there any gaps in the story and what do I have to do here and there and that sort of thing.
Well, I was going to tell you, I know a musician. Very cool. Maybe we could do a concert here and help the cause a little further down the line in 2022. It would be an honor. But I don't want to. I mean, again, there are so many things I would still like to talk about. But I feel you have something you want to talk about, very especially when I invited Coco Fusco to share with us to talk. And I said, listen, I need a picture. I always ask for a picture.
Yeah.
I got this wonderful picture, and it says, No a la Bienal de La Habana. So I figured we would talk a little bit about the biennial,
okay,
and what does it mean today, what's happening with the biennial, a little bit of reflection of what's happening with Cuba, and why there seems to be a strong movement to boycott La Bienal de La Habana.
Right.
What's going on?
Well, there is a campaign to call on the international arts community to support not participating in the biennial, which means don't go as an invited artist or as an invited critic, but it also means don't fly in there for your weekend jaunt in Havana and spend a lot of money there and go see the show. It's a call not to participate, not to stop the biennial. If they want to do a biennial, let them do a biennial, but that those who are aware of the critical political situation in Cuba should now unite together and refuse to participate. Why am I saying this? Because there are artists in prison, and they are unjustly imprisoned. Michael Osorbo is in prison because he is one of the performers of the song Patria y Vida, which has become an anthem of those who oppose the government. And they've gotten almost 9 million hits since February.
Wow.
There only are 11 million Cubans on the island and 3 in the diaspora, so that's more than half. Mm-hmm. And that means that millions more are also listening. This is a song that now Cubans, when they are fighting with police, they're screaming Patria y Vida at the police. So it has really been incorporated into the kind of collective psyche of Cubans that are opposing the government. So he's in prison. Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, the performance artist, is in prison basically because the government doesn't like his work and they don't like his message. There are over 500 young people were detained during the historic protests in July that took place all over the island, and some of them are being threatened with sentences of up to 27 years only because they were participated in a peaceful protest. And that protest and these unjust incarcerations come on the heels of 3 or 4 years of rising tension between artists, musicians, and other cultural workers in Cuba and the government over a number of problems that have to do with laws that have been imposed since Díaz-Canel came into office that are aimed at restricting what artists can do, who can be called an artist, who can present their work to the public. Now there's also, after the protests, new laws being declared to restrict what you can say on the internet. The government is going after basically younger Cubans, who are the ones who are most often participating in the culture and in the social media, and repressing them quite violently. And this is, it's not as if there wasn't any repression before.
That's what I was going to ask you, because
it has escalated.
Yeah, okay.
The thing is that Cubans got access to the internet en masse quite late. Mm-hmm. The internet entered Cuba, but mostly was in hotels in the late 90s. And then a few cyber cafes opened up in the aughts, and also people could have email accounts if they were connected with certain ministries. So some artists had email accounts, but they couldn't go surf the internet or, chit-chat, send text messages back and forth. They couldn't even have cell phones legally, most Cubans, until 2008. Once cell phone possession was legalized, young Cubans, very tech-savvy ones, very quickly figured out how to start communicating with the rest of the world using text, because they couldn't call internationally, but they could text. And then came the blogging explosion from 2009 onward, and the personalities like Yoani Sanchez, who's now known all over the world, become famous at that time. And then in 2018, Díaz-Canel allowed for internet on cell phones. And once internet was put on cell phones, then Cubans started to be able to talk to each other and to communicate with each other visually by sending pictures and videos in real time, so they could inform each other of different things. They could organize using phones. They talk to people abroad using their phones constantly. They're on Facebook all day long. And that has awakened a lot of people, but it's also created a situation for the government that's extremely threatening, because for the first time, Cubans can communicate without being mediated directly by the government.
So it's almost like being open without being open, and then let's close it before it gets...
Yeah, and so the attacks are increasing, and there is now, we're waiting to see what happens on the 15th of November, because there has been a call for a march in support of human rights and in support of the liberation of all of the detainees and political prisoners, and the government is threatening to throw everybody in jail for the rest of their lives, and demonizing people and engaging in defamation campaigns on state media against the organizers of the march. But I am hoping that Cubans will come out in numbers and express themselves. And
will there be a New York, or are the folks in Miami or in New York? Are there things being planned?
I have seen announcements of marches that are planned in many cities, not just in the United States, but also in Spain. There are, in Madrid, Barcelona, there are thousands and thousands of Cubans living there, in Paris. And so yeah, there are plans to have marches in solidarity with the planned march in Havana.
And what's the date again of that planned march?
15 de noviembre. You see, 15N, that's like the logo, 15N, 15N. You put 15N in Google or Facebook, and out pops all these things. Yeah.
And do you have any sense of some of the intellectuals or the writers there? Are they in agreement with this?
Absolutely. The 27N movement and the Movimiento San Isidro have issued statements in support of the 15N march. And the leader of the one who was the first to call for the march is Junior Garcia, who's a dramatist, who was a member of 27N, who was one of the artists who got into the Ministry of Culture last year on the 27th of November, when there was a historic protest in front of the Ministry of Culture. So he was one of the team of 30 negotiators who went in there. So that's another kind of crossover.
And talking about writers, I really like the guy that wrote Dust in the Wind, como polvo en el viento, el escritor cubano, que ha escrito muchas novelas largas recientemente. Oh my God, I can't remember his name, but Dust in the Wind, ¿no? Como polvo en el viento.
I don't know who it is.
Okay, well, we'll table that.
Okay.
But anyway, thank you for coming. It's been an amazing conversation. We could use another hour to talk some more about el exilio acá en New Jersey, el exilio en Nueva York, el exilio en Miami. But I think, would you like to hear some more music?
Absolutely.
So why don't we finish our program with some amazing music by Roberto Poveda, maestro.
Mira el cielo esta noche. Mira el cielo, está oscuro. La luna está brillando, la luna llena de un loco feliz. Los locos han salido. A comerse la noche. La luna lo ha advertido. La luna llena de un loco feliz. Si un loco va estrujando el universo, otro se abraza al viento. Quizás la libertad dure otra noche más, otra noche más. La libertad es humo. Que el viento se me lleva. Abrázame muy duro. Hagamos un pacto, una religión. Si un loco va y estrujando el universo, otro se abraza al viento. Quizás la libertad dure otra noche más, otra noche más. Si un loco va y estrujando el universo, otro se abraza al viento. Quizás la libertad dure otra noche más, otra noche más. Verano, otra noche más, otra noche. La noche de anoche, la noche, la última noche que pasé contigo. Yo quiero olvidarla, pero no he podido. La última noche en libertad, 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 libertad. Oye, la libertad. La libertad de los mulatos. La mulatocracia y la libertad. Mulato, el sueño de la vida corta, algunas veces se va, algunas veces te quita. Y lo que un día se va, quizás no viene de vuelta. Y ya no vale esperar, porque cansa la espera. Sentado en la estación de un tren que no tiene horario, ni fecha ni calendario. Allá en tu corazón, considérame, considérala, considérame, considérala, considera. Y considérame, considérala, considera. considérala. Considérame, considérala, considérala. Mulato, el sueño de la vida corta, alguna vez se te da, alguna vez se te quita, y lo que un día se va quizá no viene de vuelta y ya no vale esperar, porque cansa la espera. Sentado en la estación de un tren que no tiene horario, ni fecha ni calendario, allá en tu corazón, oye, oye, considérame, considérala, considérame, considérala, considérame, considérala, sí. Considérate.